Alright guys, let's talk science. Specifically, rocket engines. So, when you look at a rocket launch today, you're going to see the rockets on it, and it's just going to be this fat bell shooting off huge amounts of flame and exhaust, and it's big, wild explosions. It's kind of cool, right? Really friggin' wasteful. First off, they use chemicals to create the combustion that are extremely toxic to the environment. We actually have other ways of propulsion which use much cleaner chemicals. That's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, the Bell engine, that's the main guy. So, what they do is they have a pocket right here. They fill that with whatever gases they're combusting or superheating to create a fuckload of pressure, right? That gets forced through the nozzle, which increases the speed of the gases to supersonic speeds. It's absurd. They're extremely powerful and extremely efficient at specific units of pressure, or of atmospheric pressure. The problem is you have to design each bell diameter to a specific atmospheric pressure, because the atmosphere presses on the gases. So instead of going out like this, like you would basically a really big bonfire, you channel it downward. It's like how if you have a 5-pound weight at the top of the Sharpie pushing down, it's going to be a lot of force on this very small point. But if you have a 5-pound weight on top of a wood panel like this, it's going to be 5 pounds over a very large area, so there's not going to be a lot of pressure, right? So, it's a simple idea. So, the problem with the Bell engines is that as you go up, as you increase your altitude, atmospheric pressure decreases. So instead of it going down straight and having an extremely efficient engine the entire way, it just starts going out further and further and further until the engine is basically null and void, or the amount of pressure and thrust that the engine is providing is basically null and void to the rest of the sea level version. That's why we need multi-stage rockets, because you actually have different size engines at each stage to re-optimize the amount of thrust you're doing to whatever stage you're starting the next engine on. You get what I mean? Alright. This isn't a revolutionary idea. NASA realized this problem back in the 50s, and we actually came up with some pretty comprehensive solutions. They're called, or the main one being the Aerospike engine. Two cool things about that is, unlike Bell engines, the nozzle is adjustable. You can change the direction of thrust, or of exhaust, I should say, and they use much cleaner fuels. Rocket engines are famous for using something called hydrazine, which is extremely cancerous. It's so unbelievably toxic for people. The thing is literally purple, and it's gross looking, and it's supposed to smell horrendous. Besides the point. Or beside the point. These guys use hydrogen and oxygen. That's all. They come together, they combust. It's extremely powerful reaction. It's perfectly clean for the atmosphere. There's literally zero pollution from this combustion. What's really cool about these guys, though, is that the chamber is all right here, right? Or actually, the chamber, there's no central chamber. This is all an individual cone or spike of metal. And what you do is you have little exhaust ports going around the outside, and you direct those along this thing. So you're pushing the exhaust against the spike, which lets you adjust to different altitudes, keep a constant high efficiency thrust going throughout the entire launch. It's amazing technology. A couple problems with that, though. One, when it was first created, the metals that they were using for the actual cone itself were so weak to high temperatures that they would melt after just a couple of seconds after ignition. So over time, we developed a couple solutions. One is using a different kind of metal, which is much more heat resistant. The initial ones were copper alloys or copper composites. Another system they did is this. They actually Uh, the problem with the initial design was that everything down here would melt. And so that would create a really unstable craft. So they cut it off about there, give or take, depends on whatever Aerospike engine you have. What that does is that leaves you with less surface area that can actually melt, and with the better metals, they're or whatever you have left is also much stronger. And the entire thing is a lot lighter because these were extremely heavy engines. There's extremely dense metals being used. Um, those were decent Aerospike engines, but you still have a lot of problem with heat because of the shape itself. So what we did is created this guy right here. These guys are real cool. So basically, what you have here. Let me just illustrate this real quick. Ooh, nope. All right. So what you have is this shape, but then instead of having a tip there, you just elongate it. And then you have an extremely wide thing. So instead of being a circle like this one was when you look at it from that angle, you have this guy, which is a rectangle when you look at it from that angle and that angle. All right. Now you also have exhaust ports up here on these sides. I get that this looks like a uterus. Ignore it. But the exhaust ports press the exhaust against the shape, and you can change the angle that you or of the shape itself to adjust for atmospheric pressure. Really cool design, and the best part about it is it's really easy to replicate that in long distances rather than having individual circles with their own structures. You have rectangles that are just pressed together. And so instead of individual structures, it's just one long structure, one long one. It also increases effective surface area, which in this case is really important for bleeding off enough heat to keep it from melting. These were amazingly advanced, and the technology is technically possible. We just don't use them for a couple of reasons. The most recently proposed ship was called that was supposed to use these engines called the Venture Star. Now this was proposed in the late 90s by Lockheed Martin in a competition that was set up by NASA. They wanted what's called an SSTO rocket, a single stage two orbit. So instead of having to have, every rocket you see nowadays, they're going to launch up with the initial booster, drop the booster, so they shed a ton of weight, and they have a new rocket that's adjusted for that level of atmosphere, and then they keep going. With the adjustable bells, you don't need that. So they created the Venture Star. The entire thing is a wing. So landing is the same way the space shuttle does, but because it's so much larger and it generates its own lift, the entire craft does, instead of nearly melting like every space shuttle did on re-entry, which is why it's such a dangerous and costly ship to build, it lands gently and smoothly with very little damage to the hull, so it's extremely reusable. Now, Lockheed Martin never got past the prototype stage. They were supposed to build a proof of concept version at about half the scale for a very small fraction of the price, just to show that their design actually works to NASA. They had a couple problems. One, the fuel tanks were actually supposed to be part of the structure rather than there being separate structure and fuel tank, which means the fuel tanks have to be extremely strong. So they use different composites for that. They're great. They're extremely durable. They could handle the heat that you're going to experience during that, and take the external pressure of the structure. The only problem was when you superheat hydrogen like that, it will actually phase through the composite of that hull and then liquefy inside the hull and rupture the tank. So that's not going to work at that point. They eventually did create a couple versions that would work, but those were just extremely heavy. So What they proposed to do for this initial proof of concept prototype is use an aluminum a hull, or aluminum tank, which could withstand those levels of internal pressures, so the hydrogen wouldn't phase through molecularly and rupture the hull. It's a great solution. It was actually lighter than every other proposed design for that initial stage of this rocket. Another problem was initially the material that they made this part of the Aerospike engine out of was not strong enough to withstand their shape. So they had to elongate it really far, which created way too much weight for the engine itself. So the entire thing was far too stable in atmosphere. These two big things were a huge setback. Now, with the addition of the aluminum tanks, it actually pretty much solved both problems entirely, and technically speaking, they could have built a working proof of concept prototype. The problem was, NASA then came around and decided that these guys need to have the carbon tanks initially. Otherwise, the entire concept of using all these technologies as one was null and void, and there was no point in doing it in the first place. I believe that decision was wrong and extremely wasteful. That's beside the point. Fast forward to 2008 or so. At this point, NASA has actually created a new manufacturing process for that composite tank, which makes it far denser or not denser, but far stronger and able to withstand those pressures. And it was actually about 25% lighter than the aluminum ones, which are already lighter than the very old composite tanks. Solves the problem of weight, and you can use the actual initially proposed technology for the tanks. That basically solves every single one of your problems. They also have much stronger alloys and composites that they can use on the Aerospike engine, so you don't need to increase the surface area. You already have the materials that can withstand those forces anyway, or those heats anyway. Technically speaking, after all of that, the prototype works, but it was never actually built. Eventually, it became a huge political issue. The project was actually approached multiple times up until around 2013 or so by the U.S. Army. They had the funding, they had the initial concept, and all the technology readily available to build this. And at every single point of approval, it was accepted throughout the government, except at the highest levels. This is believed to actually be a problem with the newest presidential administration. Namely, Dick Cheney and the current administration absolutely hated the previous administration, specifically Al Gore's participation in it all. This is the belief. So they blackballed every single attempt to recreate the Venture Star. It's upsetting, because this would be an absolutely revolutionary design. It's an SSTO, a single stage to orbit rocket, which is the first of its kind. It's never been created in the history of man, and we had it here now. It's a little upsetting to think about. But the Aerospike is still alive and well as an idea for rocket engines, and I know most likely in the near future we're going to see rockets with them. Give it 10 to 15 years, it's going to happen.